is Sam Long.
I'm Ron Peters.
And I'm John Newton.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
after class.
Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. We are back here in the office in the middle of summer. We've had, half the summer gone so far. It's going quickly.
More than half, really, yeah. I mean, we're staring down returning to the office here in just, 2.5 weeks. So,
yep.
Yeah, our summer most of it's in the rearview mirror.
Yes. Anything exciting so far?
When this episode drops, I'll be in the UP again. So it'll be my last vacation trip of the school year, of the summer. So when we get back from the UP, just a couple more days, and it'll be back in the office. So, but I'm looking forward to it. The UP, I go dark every year. I just go off the grid, which is glorious. I love it.
Yeah, I did something similar. I don't go up north. I go out east for my off the grid. But not so off the grid. We have running water and toilets and everything.
We do have running water.
No, my whole family,
river.
all my kids, and most of my son-in-laws went to New York, which is it's nice. We had, amazingly for summer, almost no construction from Michigan to my parents' house on eastern Long Island.
Wow, that's remarkable.
That was crazy. And so we made it in 12 hours both times, which is pretty good.
Wow.
Anyway, spent a week, 5 days in New York, which for us always means seeing my family, my sister, my parents, and eating amazing New York food that we can't get in Lansing. So lots of Carvel ice cream and New York pizza and bagels and hardles. And so, it was great. It was a great trip. And I would say one of my highlights, besides catching up with my family, my brother and sister and such, my parents, is we spent a day at the ocean. And the ocean, it's kind of like you never know what ocean you're going to meet. Is it going to be like the Lake Michigan, pretty calm, ripply water, or is it going to be like the monstrous waves that destroy you and you got to just kind of be careful the whole time? Yeah. Or is it going to be that middle place that's perfect for body surfing? And it was the perfect for body surfing day. And so we spent most of the day in the water, catching waves, riding them in. It was glorious. And you might be wondering, how can you do that with your back? Interesting.
How do you do that with your back, by the way?
Yeah. With water, it just takes the back out of it because, you're floating and there's no pressure on the back. For those of you who are tracking the experimental intracept procedure that I'm trying to get done, we had good news while in New York, and that is, last word is my surgeon thought I was a textbook candidate for this experimental procedure that might help a lot, except my X-ray interpreter described my spine in such a way that made me ineligible. And so we filed for an addendum, take another look at it. Can you see it? And that went through. The X-ray said, oh, yeah, I see that. Let's add that to the report. So now I meet all the criteria by the letter of the law, and it's a matter of the surgeon getting permission from the health insurance provider. So for those of you who've been praying that we'd get that X-ray reinterpreted, thank you. Prayer answered. Next step is, does Blue Care Network cover this procedure? It's so new. Yeah. Medicare just started covering it this year. They may not. So I might be the first one they approve for it or the first one they reject for it. So we'll see. So keep praying.
Experimental candidate.
Keep praying about that. It's huge for us.
Cool. I also kind of went off the grid. I went to Arkansas in the middle of nowhere to hang out with my cousins in a creek for a week. It was pretty great. We literally just sat in chairs in the creek. It was nice. It was a rock bottom instead of like dirt bottom.
Yeah.
So it was a sort of bluish gray, clearish, and it was wonderful. And then we went to an MLS game in St. Louis. And I took the train, which was fantastic.
I heard about this. Yeah. I was talking to Jordan the other day, and they turned out he was on the train with you. One of our
to Chicago. Yeah. So I love the train. I'm sold. So if I can go by train to places, I think I'm going to from now on. But anyway, so it was also a good time, just chilling. It was nice.
He said that you really endorsed the train. Yeah. Which I haven't ridden a train anywhere since I was in elementary school.
I mean, it would have been 14 hours of driving.
Yeah.
Right, and all the gas and all the hassle, or it was a little bit longer because there was a layover in Chicago. But I think it was something like 18 hours. Mm-hmm. But I did work and watched movies for the whole time. Yeah. What's wrong? Instead of driving and constantly being, it was, and flying would have been 2 to 3 times the price.
Right.
So.
Well, and on a train, you probably had more room. You can walk around.
I can't even compare it to planes for us tall people.
Exactly.
Planes are the worst.
I totally agree, yeah.
It's plenty more than I needed.
Wow.
So, and they actually lean back. So great.
I've yet to be on a train ride more than an hour and a half. So, but I need to try this once for a long trip.
Yeah, I'm intrigued. And your endorsement rings,
I mean, I'm just one person. Well, we're back at it, and we're going to do something kind of interesting for the next 2 episodes, at least to us. We regularly get emails and mailers from different companies with books they're trying to sell that have just come out. And one came across my desk not too long ago by Christopher Wright, a good Old Testament scholar. It's the Old Testament in 7 sentences. And there's a New Testament companion as well. I'm like, the whole Old Testament in 7 sentences. And I think the subtitle really is A Small Introduction to a Vast Topic. So what he does is he's actually taking a text that he uses to expand on different sort of themes and things. So it's kind of a bait and switch. It's not just 7 sentences, but he's at least trying that. And I thought, that's really cool. What if we tried that? What if we gave that a go? And so that's what this episode is going to be. We're going to do an Old Testament one. Then we're going to do a second episode with New Testament. But can we distill each Testament down to 7 verses or passages? We definitely have.
Let's go with passages.
We went with passages because if you have listened to this podcast ever before, we're big on context, and so it's hard to just pull one out without the rest of the context and so forth. So we each independently did this
without reading Wright's book.
Correct.
Yeah.
Well, I read it, but it didn't matter.
Okay.
Yeah. I read it on the train, actually. It was a quick. Well, I flipped through it anyway. We ended up in very different places, I think. And so we're going to try it, and we're going to go through and see where we land, and hopefully this will be helpful to you. I think it'll be helpful for me. I'm going to have to redo it again. This is my first go. I'm it's not good enough. I can tell that already. But John and I had similar approaches. We like to tell the story or the narrative of it, and so we're going to do that. Ron has some other approach that he doesn't.
I failed. Is what it really comes down to. I couldn't do it. I don't know how this guy pulled it off to say he could do it in 7 sentences, because for me, I couldn't do it. As I told the guys, I was sitting at my house at a garage sale, with my phone going through passages and trying to figure it out, and I couldn't make it happen. All I could do was think of various themes and try to track those themes through, and I could do that in 7 verses. But tell the Bible story, or at least the Old Testament story, like I said, for me, it was just total failure. So
how we're going to do this is Sam and I are going to go through it kind of chronologically, story-wise.
Canonically, yeah.
And, mine's more chronological than canonical, but roughly the same. And Ron's going to trace his theme as it shows up within kind of the narrative arc Sam and I are painting, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's how I see the Bible. I just see a lot of different stories kind of weaving in and out of each other, and I couldn't land on a single story. Do I want to announce my theme? Should I tell people what my theme is, or should I let them guess for it?
No, John says no. I say yes, but I don't care.
Let them get. I mean, it's good. I don't know what that looks like, but
all right,
we'll
see.
Okay.
It's all an experiment. We're going to have to retake the entire episode.
Can pick up on what the theme is.
So you're just going to read the verse. And then,
I mean, if I don't tell,
and then get to the next verse, and at the end, it's the big.
Yeah, really, you got to say. That's what I'm saying.
That's what I'm saying. I got to tell them what the theme is, otherwise it makes no sense.
Okay, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, tell them the theme.
We're
by all
good.
means.
Okay, good. I was like,
that's why I didn't understand.
What theme are you going to pull through our story?
I mean, the one that stuck out to me was the theme of shepherding, because I just see that throughout the Old and New Testament, and I think there are reasons why the shepherding theme plays such a big role. And so I just had to focus in on that and think about various passages that told that story. So those will be the verses that I'll be looking at in both the Old and New Testament.
Okay, well, all right, let's do it. So I started in the beginning in Genesis 1. I thought that was appropriate. And I put Genesis 1:1 down as a sort of a placeholder for the entire chapter, that God created a good place, that God created a world and for us to live and thrive and all that. And so I started with Genesis 1. Anyone else have Genesis 1?
Yeah, I did too. Genesis 1:1, and for the same reasons, a good God creating a good creation with good plans for that creation. And so no matter what theme I think of, it all goes back to that. If God's not the creator, then the whole story starts falling apart.
There's nothing to shepherd.
Pretty much, yeah.
Right.
And so I had to start with that as well.
All right. I did not start with Genesis 1. For me, I treated Genesis 1 through 11 in one verse.
Interesting.
So maybe we didn't get to my verse yet. So.
Okay.
So your verse kind of like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Everything was good.
I think it's important to start from a foundation of God, like belief in this deity that created it all, especially in contrast to other deities, other religions, all that. So for me, it was important.
Yeah. When I originally had told it in terms of 12 sentences, and then I had to whittle it down to 7. Genesis 1 was in there, but as I had to carve down to 7,
you have to choose.
It's one of the ones that got merged.
And as a listener, you may be wondering, why 7? Because that's what the book did. I don't think there's any and perfect number, all that, whatever. So obviously, it's arbitrary why it's 7, but here we are. All right.
Well, both you and I then have something from those first 11. Then, like, do you have another passage from Genesis 1 through 11?
Yeah, but I want to hear what Sam's second one.
I got
is.
another
His
one.
second one
Okay.
might be before my
gotcha.
first one.
Gotcha.
So I had to include the fall in some way in Genesis 3 because it'll set up all that is to come. And I chose maybe not what you would expect. I chose 22, which says, "The Lord God, see the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, and now he might reach out his hand, take also the tree of life, and he live forever. Therefore God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till and all that, and he drove the man out." And so I used that sort of as the this is the concern that sin is entered in. They're going to live eternally in sin. And so God sort of kicks them out of the garden, and that sets certain other things in motion moving forward.
And in my original, when I was first thinking it through and I was trying to do big picture story, I was in a similar place. I thought about what the serpent said to Eve, you will be like gods.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
That whole statement and how that has shaped my understanding of sin, broadly speaking. And so I was in a similar place. I chose a different, passage, but I was thinking a similar thing to what you were thinking, again, trying to tell that big picture story.
Right.
Do you want to share that passage that lines up with that theme?
You're talking about my passage now?
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's actually from the next chapter.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's from Genesis 4. When I was thinking about the shepherding theme, one of the first things it said about about Abel is that he was a shepherd. And I'm like, wow, that shepherding theme emerges really early in the story. And so as I was thinking through passages about shepherds, it's like, wow, Abel was a shepherd. I wonder, is it just coincidence or is there something more thematic for the telling of the Old Testament story and that theme of shepherding? So Genesis 4:4 talking about Abel being a shepherd.
All right. So I think we're ready to get to my starter verse.
Yeah.
My starter verse is from Genesis 8. And it's beginning in verse 20. Maybe I'll read it and then explain why, because it may be less common knowledge as far as listeners are concerned. Beginning in verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humans. For the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. And so why I picked this one is to me it presupposes, Sam's first two verses, like God created this great world and sin made a mess of it. What happens next chronologically is that God kind of did his reboot with Noah and kind of cleansed the earth. And immediately after the flood, bad stuff's happening, right? And so why I find this passage as setting up the Bible story is that here God covenants with really Noah, and then in its retelling all of creation, that I'm not going to be the God who destroys everything every time humans make a mess of this world. I promise that the cycles of creation are going to continue, which means, to me, which implies I'm going to find a way to interact with my creation to preserve it, to pursue my original intentions with it, to deal with the problem of human sin, short of starting all over again all the time. Right? So it presupposes he started this thing and it went bad, and destruction was his first approach. But going forward, God's going to find another way. He promises, by saying he's not going to destroy the earth again, he's promising, I'm going to find some other way to get my creation plan on track. So to me, this verse is kind of like the culmination of Genesis 1 through 11. Like, the Bible story and human history could have been cyclical, like the Stoics, right? But it's going to be linear because God's going to allow creation to march forward in a world where humans are going to keep on sinning. And it kind of leaves us with this cliffhanger. What is God going to do then? Because one of the things that happens right after the flood is they're right back to sinning again. Like the sinning didn't change, but there is a change in God's strategy. He's never again going to cut short the cycles of creation the way he did. He's going to find another way.
What's kind of interesting about that is that you can almost think of as repeating cycles. They're necessary to move it forward. It's like history is not just cyclical. It's moving forward, but there are cycles that move it forward. It's like a kind of a both and kind of a thing.
But the cycle is not going to be creation, destruction, recreation.
Right.
Which is what we have in Genesis 1 through 9. It's going to be creation, fall, decreation, recreation, and it's going to stay the same going forward. Only what is God going to do about the sin problem? That's kind of the cliffhanger going forward.
Right on. Yep.
Okay. So we're all on board with that. Creation, sinfulness, now God's got to do something about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? And so that leads to the next one for me, which is Abraham, chapter 12 of Genesis, and Genesis 12, 1 through 3 especially, where we call it the call to Abraham, what have you, but Abraham is called out to go where God sends him, and he's going to make this blessing of Abraham and of the nation and of the world through this man Abraham. And so this is like one of the most important texts in the Old Testament for me, right? Because this is going to set up a lot of what's going to come afterwards. It's going to show how God is making these initial forays into restoration, into turning things around, into using humanity to fix humanity on some level. And so I couldn't do this without this passage.
You want to read it?
Sure.
So it may not be fresh for everyone listening.
That's probably true. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And we see this promise repeated multiple times in the next few chapters in different ways, stars in the sky, sand on the seashore, all that business. But clearly God is using Abraham's descendants, to bring about a new work in the world.
Yeah. This is my next one as well.
Yeah.
Like Abraham is the beginning of God's alternative to wiping out the earth every time things get bad. It's the way he is going to not destroy the earth, but continue to preserve things. Somehow, this man, Abraham, and his family are part of the solution. And, this is why I only really wanted one passage for Genesis 1 through 11, just because the story of the Old Testament is very much the story of Abraham's descendants, and arguably the New Testament as well. It's not necessarily going to be the story of Cain and Abel, and, that's not going to keep coming up. But the Abraham thing is going to keep coming up. Although once you get to Romans, Adam comes back a little bit theologically for Paul. Right. But another thing that made me choose this verse is the way it ends. Through him, his descendants, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Like this thing God is doing through Abraham and his offspring is for the whole world. And I think that's what makes this a really pivotal. Genesis 1 through 11 is the whole world is under sin in a bad way. Now this is a solution that's as big as the problem, going after the whole world.
Yeah. I hear what you're saying about wanting to get forward out of the early stuff to but for me, there's so much backstory that's required. I don't know. It's tough. It was tough to what to choose.
I have to do
choose.
Genesis 1 and 3 for 9, 8, and 9 to make sense.
Yeah.
And why, part of what influenced this is I do this. I have a project for a class where I have them write out the whole Bible story, and I limit them to 5.
Mm-hmm.
And I give them the 5.
Yeah.
Just because it's too hard.
Right.
We're at that point in their formation, it's a little too soon for that. And I call the first phase, historically when people, theologians try to summarize the Bible in 5 stages, it's usually creation. Usually they do it in 3: creation, fall, redemption. Right. And then, and what gets lost in there is, well, where's the church? Where is Israel?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I want to add them to the 3 to become 5. And how I do that is I just instead of creation, I call it creation's collapse. I just kind of conflate that to one.
Creation, it collapsed, by the way.
Yeah. And so that's the first phase of the Bible story. But it's not hopeful in the same way that Abraham and the promise after the flood is. But anyway, don't want to get into the weeds.
Right. All right.
So did any shepherding things run into the narrative yet?
Not till we get to 1 Samuel.
Oh, boy.
Okay.
Well, you'll be quiet for a while.
Yes, I will.
So the next thing for me is Exodus.
Yeah, let's do that one.
All right. Because a lot of things happen in Genesis, obviously, and we move forward quite a few years. But in Exodus, and when they come out of slavery, for me, it's kind of the next phase in what God is doing, where he sets up what he wants this people, right? He has made good on some of the promises. They have become a numerous people, right? And how are they going to be a blessing to the nations? Chapter 19 on Sinai, he lays it out. And so starting in verse 4, he says, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom, holy nation. These are the words you shall speak to the Israelites. And again, for me, this is like a huge text. It's setting them up for, this is your identity, right? You are a people that has been freed from slavery. You are my people, and this is what it should look like, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And so a lot of what comes after that is, especially in Torah, is built on that concept and idea. So I had to include that one.
Yeah, this Exodus 19 made my original list.
Really?
It's where I wanted to go after Abraham.
Yeah.
I wanted to go to Exodus 19,
Yep.
but I had to cut something.
Oh.
So I did picked a later one and said, this presupposes that.
Right.
But maybe I'll share mine. And my next one might, so what's going to be my third might be your next one.
I think it probably is.
Yeah. So I think what you had there is pivotal. Like the Genesis 12 is like somehow through Abraham's descendants, God's going to be a blessing to all nations. And, this project begins in earnest after the Exodus people is the continuation of that project, right?
Yeah.
It's a way of saying those Jews who came out of Egypt and met Moses and got together on the mountain, this is Abraham's descendants.
Because the reality is, it's not very specific. When God says these promises to Abraham, it's not super specific. And this is one piece of specificity. Like, this is what it looks like to be a blessing.
Yeah.
Can you praise holy nation? And so little by little, you're getting more. They know where they're supposed to be going, and now they know what they're supposed to be doing, sort of. But I think the next passage even expands on that even more.
Yeah, and I like, to me, that language of priestly nation continues that thread of blessing to all nations from Genesis 12. Because it's like, all right, in what sense are they priests? A priestly nation. They are set apart by God for his purpose of being a blessing to the nations. Yeah. Seems to be implied.
Right.
They're serving God for the good of all nations. And that's kind of how they're priests. So, yeah, my next one is Deuteronomy 4, 5 through 8. Did that make your list? Or did you go
100%.
somewhere else?
That was in one of my lists as well. You guys have landed on a lot of stuff that were in a list I had going at one point.
Okay, so I'll read 4, 5 through 8 and explain why I think that could follow Genesis 12. And so this is Moses really addressing. It's kind of like the preface of Moses' presentation of the law to the people of God. Like, so they've been delivered from Egypt. They're now on Mount Sinai, ready to learn. All right, what are we supposed to do exactly? I know we're set apart, we're treasured, somehow priests.
We're treasured, all that.
What is that going to look like? And so to me, this is what fleshes it out. Deuteronomy 4, beginning verse 5. See, just as the Lord my God has charged me, I now teach you statutes and ordinances for you to observe in the land that you are about to enter and occupy. You must observe them and perform them, for this will show your wisdom and discernment to the peoples, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and discerning people. For what other nation What other great nation has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is whenever we call to him? And what other great nation has statutes and ordinances as just as this entire law that I am setting before you today?
I love that passage.
It's so good.
Yeah,
Right.
I love that passage.
And so the logic is, from whether you pivot from Exodus 19 or Genesis 12, God's somehow going to use Abraham's descendants to be a blessing to all nations. What is the mechanism by which God's going to do that? And it's the Torah.
Right.
It's the instruction, this unique, set-apart way of life that he is entrusting to his people. I wish the word covenant was in this passage.
Yes.
It's not. I wanted a verse that had the word covenant and show your wisdom to the peoples by following these laws, but they're not together in one verse.
Yeah.
So, but God is making a covenant that includes statutes, instructions, a way of life, and that way of life is from God for his people on display for the world to see, that they may be drawn to a God like no other.
I mean, for me, the reality is 19, 4 through 6 should be followed immediately by 4, 5 through 8. Because they would go perfectly together. Yeah. You're going to be a kingdom, priest, and holy nation. See what I'm laying out for you today. Like they go really well together, and you can't separate them. They're saying similar things in a slightly different way. Yep. And so, unfortunately, they ended up being 2 for me when it's really just 1. But.
Yeah. And what it says about God, that here Israel's God is teaching them how to live. Like what other nation can say, our God or our gods have taught us a way of living, that it's really different. This is a very different setup. I think even to the New Testament era, it's like God's teaching us how to live. That's not what God's do.
Yeah. So I love this passage, and it does bring together pretty much all of it. And I think if you as a listener have never heard this passage before, then you probably have misunderstood what Torah is about.
Amen. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's a frustration for me. A lot of Christians haven't gotten here. They assume it's rules, we're making God happy so we can be saved or something like that. And no, this is what it's about. Like you're living such a different quality of life. People are like, holy cow, I'm all about that.
Yeah, I'd love to live like
and that's what Torah formed living is supposed to be. So.
Yeah. At least for the masses. Maybe for the people in powerful positions, they don't like it because it certainly challenges the powerful and the wealthy. But for the mass of the population, they're like, man, we'd love to live in Israel. Let's get a piece of that action.
Yeah, and I think it tells the story well that Torah, the laws, the Old Covenant, which are all the same, right? It plays a positive role in the Bible story.
Yep. And again, I think it's another thing is because when you get to the New Testament, Paul's like, the law is bad, which is not exactly what he says, but that's how it's framed. Like, this offsets that. Right, it says the Torah for them was a positive thing. It was a gift. It wasn't, more rules from God. Enough already. That was never how they. That was not how they viewed it.
Enough already. Now these rules and regulations.
Yeah, and so I think we would probably agree that these laws, this strategy of using a people with a set apart way of life to be God's tool of using Abraham's descendants to be a blessing to all nations, that strategy is going to continue in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Yeah, and that's key for us. This is not just going to be. This was the Old Testament thing that the New Testament leaves behind.
Right.
It's going to change what it looks like social politically, but the core of this, that it's the set apart way of life of God's people, that is the way He is going to use His people to reach all nations. There's no way you get through the teachings of Jesus and the writings of the New Testament letters and say that's still not the center.
Right.
It remains that.
Yep, agreed.
But that's next episode. So I've used 5 of my 7 already.
Oh wow!
I know.
Crazy.
I know. Like I said, it was the first go at it. I might have to tweak it moving forward, but.
Well, we didn't have a lot of time to get this together, so when your book comes out someday,
my 7 sentences.
Your 7 sentences, exactly.
So next, I go to Judges 2. Is that the next one? Do you guys have something?
Yep,
before then?
you're up.
You're up.
Okay, I'm up. I'm up for the next one. So this is where I start to double time. And Judges 2 to me is symbolic to what's going to happen over the next several books of the Old Testament, like at least the rest of the primary history. Verses 11 through 15. And so this, just to contextualize this a little bit, people received the laws, made the Old Covenant on Mount Sinai with Moses. The whole first generation dies in the wilderness, and then Joshua leads them into the promised land, and things seem to be on track with them becoming a set-apart people who live by the ways of Torah, being shaped to be this blessing to all nations. And now there's this dark turn in the story. Joshua dies.
No.
And then there's this turning point beginning in Judges 2, beginning in verse 11. Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples, who were all around them, and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baal and the Astartes. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against people, and he gave them over to the plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the power of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them to bring misfortune, as the Lord had warned them and sworn to them, and they were in great distress. So to me, what this verse symbolizes is what I think happens for the rest of Judges and Samuel and Kings.
Yeah.
That is, God brought them to the land. He gave them this set-apart way of life that they're supposed to live out, so it's a witness to the nations, and then somehow he's going to use their set-apart ways to draw all people to himself. But they got into the land, and they said, no. Like, we don't want to serve God the way he has asked us to serve him. We want a little bit of mixing and matching the way of life God gave us and what the nations around us are doing.
Yep.
So they kind of hybridize their calling from God with the worldly agenda of the nations. And as a result, God brings his judgment upon them, and he fights against them as his discipline. Like, it's not okay for you to abandon the covenant, the Torah, the laws I gave you. Mm-hmm. I'm going to have to use nations around you to judge you. And, in the book of Judges, this happens through a series of judges. But in the history books from 1 Samuel 8 on, the same thing is going to happen with kings. Like, kings are going to be how they imitate the nations, and God's still going to use the kings of other nations to punish them and their kings. So bottom line here, Israel breaks the covenant, rejects Torah as their way of life, and receives God's judgment for it.
Yeah, my next passage I'm not going to give right now because it's way down the road, but I kind of did what you did in previous ones, which I presuppose that they screwed up. I talk about a solution from that. But it is really important to know, like, they never embraced the Torah-formed life, and to their detriment and to the world's detriment. And that's an important fact to bring out.
I think we're probably getting close to one of my next passages here then. If we're getting into, like, 1 Samuel.
Let's hear how the shepherding theme weaves back in.
Well,
so far, not at all.
But I think we begin to see why is going to weave back in, and you've already kind of touched on it, John, when you talk about how from like Samuel on, it's basically focusing on the kingship and the role of the kingship and the greater fortunes or misfortunes of Israel. And to understand the shepherding theme, you got to understand how shepherding connects to the kingship. A passage I always like to point out to students is like in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is this king who's oppressing his people, and the people are crying out to their gods about it. But they say the king is supposed to be a shepherd. Like, those are their exact words. The king is supposed to be a shepherd. And I think that's why the shepherding theme is so important to the larger structure of the story, how it undergirds the story that you guys are telling. And so the passage that stands out to me that helps us see that begin to emerge is in 1 Samuel chapter 16 when God sent Samuel to Jesse's house to find the next king of Israel. And he's like going through all the sons and looking at them and saying, oh, man, this guy looks like he could be it, or this guy could be it. And God just keeps saying no to him. And so in verse 10, it says, Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen any of these. Samuel said to Jesse, are all of your sons here? And he says, there remains yet the youngest, but he is keeping the sheep. And so it's this idea of David being a shepherd. just sort of natural vocation is I'm out there watching the sheep. And I think that's a very deliberate thing where I think the authors understand the shepherding metaphor for kingship. And they're like, the king's supposed to be a shepherd. Let's get a guy who understands shepherding. And so David is specifically portrayed as a shepherd. Now, there's a lot more to it. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to let it sort of unfold as we keep telling the story. But for understanding Israel's function, as you guys have done a very good job of pointing out, understanding the role of the shepherd within that function, I think, is a very important part of understanding the story.
And I think, if we were to locate this shepherding within the trajectory we established a little bit, as far as now we're in the context of Israel having rejected Torah. Part of that rejection is choosing to have a king like the nations. God doesn't like that. It wasn't his strategy for them. It's not the Torah way. Oh. But what's important, and I think you're pointing to it in choosing this passage, is God's going to let them pick a king anyway. But his desire is, well, if you can pick a king who can, shepherd the people the way God does, it will be a king who leads the people in living out Torah. Yeah, so that they become that nation who is still a light to the nations. So instead of it being through a loose federation of tribes like we have in Torah, it's going to be through a monarchical structure. But that monarchical structure is going to have a leader that's kind of like a shepherd, and is going to shepherd the people in the way of Torah. Yeah. So here, my last thing was they lost it all and broke it all. Your passage represents God didn't abandon them once they did this. He's trying to make he's trying to turn their rebellion in a way that can get them back on track for his Torah vision. And this shepherd, King David, is one of his attempts at doing that.
Yeah, and it will be a successful attempt. This is the funny thing about it, is it grows out of Israel's rebellion. And God says, kingship's not going to work well for you. When they ask for a king, he's like, all right, you can have a king, but this is what it's going to look like, and it's not going to be pretty. And God's like, you know what? They're asking for a bad thing. I'm going to show them how I can take their bad request and turn it into ultimately fulfilling what I want for the nation. And I just think that's a really cool story.
Yeah. Reveals something about God that
it really does.
That does get kind of lost in how I narrate this period.
Same.
Oh, thank you for throwing me that. I appreciate that.
Yeah. I'm still not up. I got a long way to go, I think.
I pivot to Jeremiah.
Same.
Okay, so we can go to my next verse, because again, it's part of the telling of the story, flipping to 2 Samuel, and it's a passage I think most people are going to recognize. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, this is where God establishes his eternal covenant with David. And so I always hate these thin pages in our Bibles because they're hard to turn. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 16.
When you read the Bible more, it creates space between those pages.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, the Old Testament, at least, it clearly doesn't.
As you get older, you lose the feeling in your fingers, and that makes it harder.
Lick 'em.
So God establishes a covenant with David, and in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 16, he says, your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. And so this eternal covenant with David becomes an important part of the story. And I think it's a key part for the unfolding of the Old Testament story, especially as you get into the New Testament and telling the New Testament story. This idea of God making this eternal covenant with David, which to me always struck me as strange, because we've said this kingship idea really wasn't God's plan. This idea of having a human king and a monarchical structure strikes me as weird. And for God to say to David, this bad idea that Israel have, I'm going to now carve into stone and make eternal, seems to be almost like a capitulation on God's part to say, I'll go with second best. And so that's why this part of it is so important for the story, but leaves me scratching my head. Like, why would you do that, God? That just seems really weird to me.
Yeah. I think I have a passage that represents what you're getting at. Here you're talking about this kingship project, which is a structural rejection of Torah. God's in this give and take relationship with his people, so he's willing to do it, but he wants to turn the kingship for good.
Right.
And the kings end up turning it on itself for bad.
Yeah.
But you're noting this promise that God somehow commits to redeeming this and folding this institution in his future redemptive plans for his people.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to get, at least some of us are going to get at that, how God's going to fold that in. But maybe from the perspective of the prophets instead of the history book.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I definitely thought about including this passage in mine because I did kind of it is a story arc, but it's also a covenantal arc, and that's kind of an important covenant in things. Yeah. I dropped it though. I think it's a, I don't know. It's important, but I think they're more important things. And like like you said, he's adapting and using things that he didn't want in the first place, and I want to focus on things that more he does want in the first place.
I understand that. Yeah, I get that.
Yeah. Where do you go next, Sam?
Jeremiah 31.
So do I. That's exactly my next.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know what passage you guys are talking about.
Yes, probably one that's very familiar to our listeners. You've probably heard it at various times. 31 and following. The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, a covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, says the Lord. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. No longer shall they teach one another or say to each other, know the Lord, for they shall know me, from the least of them to the greatest, says the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity and remember their sin no more. And so it hits, for me, all the key themes. Covenant, yeah, they screwed it up. They didn't, here's Torah. And this is where the whole, representative, you brought in judges to show they screwed it up. This assumes they already did, right? Yep. And so they screwed it up, but God's not giving up on them. There's going to be a new covenant that he's going to create, and it's going to sort of set the stage for what is to come.
Yeah, and that's why I loved it. I mean, my last passage had them breaking the covenant. Mm-hmm. And then this is God saying, even though you broke it up in so many ways for so long, I'm going to renew it. And this one doesn't quite get at that. And there's going to be a role of a Davidic descendant in there.
Right.
It's just the big picture.
Yep.
There will be a new covenant. Who's going to inaugurate it? How it's going to come down? This passage doesn't say. In the similar way that when God tells Abraham he's going to be a blessing to all nations, we're not told how. There's going to be a new phase, and we're not told exactly how.
Yeah.
Where do you go from there?
I was going to say, that leads me to Isaiah. And there are a lot of passages I could have chosen from Isaiah, especially 40 through 66. I chose one because it actually is going to tie in with some New Testament things that we're going to get next episode. I went with 42, Isaiah 42, verses 5 through 7. Thus says God, the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, so call back to the beginning, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people upon it and spirit to those who walk in it. I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. I have taken you by hand and kept you. I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison those who sit in darkness. And it kind of goes on like that. And that I chose that because, again, there's the callback to creation, there's the use of covenant, and then there's this is your job. You're a light to the nations. You are to bring justice and so forth to the world. That's how you live this thing out moving forward. And so I ended on the high mission note for the Old Testament.
So help me follow logic. So he promises to have a new covenant, and this is kind of fleshing out what that new covenant will look like?
A little bit, yes.
Okay, yeah. Got you.
Not dissimilar from what Abraham and then moving forward to Deuteronomy and Exodus did, but yeah.
Yeah. So, I followed with Isaiah 49, and this was my attempt to weave in what Ron had in there with the Davidic, this covenant with David. So I went with the servant songs.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. 49 beginning in verse 1. Listen to me, coastlands. Pay attention, you peoples from far away. The Lord called me before I was born. While I was in my mother's womb, he named me. He made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand, he hid me. He made me a polished arrow. In his quiver, he hid me away. And he said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified. But I said, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing in vanity. Yet surely my cause is with the Lord, and my reward with my God. And now the Lord says, who formed me in the womb to be his servant, to bring back Jacob to him, that Israel might be gathered to him. For I am honored in the sight of the Lord, and my God has become my strength. He says, it is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the survivors of Israel. I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. think it accomplishes much of the same thing.
Yeah.
It just highlights the role of servant language.
Yeah.
And I think here the servant in this passage is Israel. But in this section of the servant songs, we see the image that Jesus is going to pick up to say, hey, I'm the one that's turning Israel into servant Israel. I'm the one that's gathering the tribes of Israel into this people that will be a light to the nations. So this passage I think both of these passages affirms God hasn't given up on Abraham's descendants being a blessing to the nations. Right. In the new covenant, it's not going to be a new covenant that does something different than what God said to Abraham. Because people can say, yeah, in the new covenant, the old covenant, God was trying to use Abraham's descendants. That didn't work out. So he started a new covenant with Jesus where he's just going to come personally, take care of business. and so bypassing the Israel people. Both of these passages from Isaiah say, no, the new covenant time to come, the restoration to come, is going to be a gathering of the Israelites and a using them to be a light to the nations, which was God's original strategy with Abraham and Genesis 12 and on the covenant he made with them in Deuteronomy 4. Does yours plug in anywhere here?
It does, I think in a more specific way. I just want to summarize my passages real quick because they all tie together in that. To me, one of the big ones is from Daniel chapter 7. When Daniel gives his prophecy, I saw one coming like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient One, was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship and peoples and nations, languages, that they should serve him, an everlasting dominion. And so this idea of this everlasting dominion, which people are like, well, how does that fit into the shepherding theme? You don't see the word shepherd there. But if you go back to Isaiah chapter 40, verse 11, it says, see, the Lord God comes with might, and his arm rules for him. His reward is with him, and his recompense before him. He will feed his flock like a shepherd, and he will gather the lambs in his arms, and carry them in his bosom, and gently lead the mother sheep. And just as the last passage on that theme is Ezekiel chapter 34, which is all God's condemnation of the shepherds of Israel, and I will be their shepherd and all that. And so, to me, this is God beginning to kind of resolve the problem, but we don't see the full resolution. On the one hand, he's made a covenant with David that his throne is going to endure forever. But God begins to say to his people, I am going to take over the shepherding responsibilities. That, we're going to get back to the original plan where you had a shepherd. But at the end of the Old Testament, it's still kind of up in the air. It's like, well, how can you fulfill your covenant with David while you take over the shepherding rule and do so in a way that you rule over all the nations, like in Daniel chapter 7, that it's not even just ruling over Israel, but everybody else. It's kind of like we have this puzzle that we don't see the final pieces for. But I think it's really important for understanding God and his relationship to Israel, and then Israel's relationship ultimately to the rest of the world, that we see finally resolved when we get to the New Testament.
Yeah, I'll ramp on here. This is my last passage.
Okay.
Do you have one left? Or
no, I'm done.
Okay. Oh, you're already done?
Yeah. Isaiah was it.
Okay. So, yeah, I also ended with Daniel 7, and I kind of have to reread a little bit of it to explain the rationale of why I ended here. So, beginning in verse 9, and this is after we have this vision of 4 beasts, and these beasts represent the nations that appear to be in charge of the world.
Yeah.
Right? And so in 9 it says, as I watched, thrones were set, and an ancient one took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels burning fire. A stream of fire issued and flowed out of his presence. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood attending him. The court sat in judgment, and books were opened. So here is God is setting up court because he's about to set the nations right. I watched then because the noise of the arrogant words that the horn was speaking, and as I watched, the beast was put to death and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. So here's God bringing judgment to the nations, the specific nation that's causing Israel the most havoc at the moment gets his due. But other nations' existence is prolonged for a while. Like, God's going to judge the immediate threat to Israel, But other nations are going to continue because they have a function in God's plan going forward. As I watched in the night vision, I saw one like a human being, some translations say son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. And as he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him, to him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and language should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. And I think in its original context, Daniel is talking about the one like a human being, I believe, is Israel. Because when we get to the interpretation of it, it pretty much says it is. So it talks about as God's ultimate judgment coming forward is to bring down the nations and raise up his set-apart people and give them a kingdom, a rightly ordered, just kingdom. And, of course, once you get in the New Testament, this comes to take on richer meaning as Jesus identifies himself as Son of Man. Maybe drawn upon this, maybe drawn upon Ezekiel, maybe drawn upon Enoch, whatever. But it's like this one like the Son of Man is kind of like Jesus coming down, not replacing Israel, but gathering Israel and entrusting a kingdom to them, which is the promise of this passage. And so it ends, I think, with Israel saying the nations aren't in charge of world history. God is. He's promised to make a new covenant. Somehow the line of David's going to be in the mix. And at the end of the day, there will be an eternal kingdom that God's people will receive. We long for that day.
Yeah. Amen.
Yeah, interesting. Well, we're out of time, but I'd be interested in your all's thoughts and observations from our three approaches, if you had any. I had one just right off the bat.
Sure.
Yeah,
None of us included any wisdom literature.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
I really wanted to.
Yep.
So
Fear of the Lord's beginning of wisdom. I really wanted to, but anyway.
So I have a second list that's all about wisdom, and that one made it in
That
there.
theme.
Yeah. So, and to me, that wasn't a big enough theme to really to follow through. But I did have a wisdom theme going all the way back to Genesis.
Yeah,
so.
sure. Also, for me, my approach was kind of a hybrid. Like it was the story, but it's also kind of covenant theology, and so so I was kind of like in between those two things, and I don't know, that may not have worked.
Yeah, I think if there was a governing theme that guided my choices, it did follow the problem is a problem with the whole world. The solution is going to come through Abraham's descendants, but they exist for the whole world. I tended to gravitate toward passages that emphasize their obedient, their set apart nature is for the whole world.
Mm-hmm, sure.
Their covenant they made and the laws were for the whole world, and the consequences they did were like becoming too much like the world, so that they're no good for the whole world. And at the end, they're going to be gathered, restored, and given a dominion that will encompass the whole world. And so I think I gravitated outward toward the world kind of verses.
No, and I think that's good because I think that helps people understand passages like in James, where James talks about friendship with the world. And they don't realize that one of Israel's big mistakes was trying to be friends with the world. You have neighbors and you want to be like them and worship their gods. I think James is thinking about that kind of stuff. He's like, that was the problem. That's where we got off track. And so I think it's a good theme to recognize because it didn't, like I said, it informs so many other places in the Bible.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I would have gone that way if I didn't have an idea of the New Testament coming next.
Fair.
Oh, yeah.
And I wouldn't have maybe ended with kingdom language, a kingdom passage, if I didn't know that the New Testament started with kingdom language.
Right.
Like that. So Daniel was a nice hinge to get kingdom language on the map as a way of describing the way Jesus articulated the hope he was offering to the people. But I think you're right. The Psalms didn't really make it in.
Yeah.
The wisdom literature didn't make it in.
How does Psalm 23 not make it in?
Short stories didn't make it in.
I thought about it, but to me, it's like everybody else, Psalm 23.
I
I wanted to choose passages that maybe people weren't totally thinking of. But yeah, Psalm 23 is so obvious.
And this has been the problem for Old Testament theology.
Yeah,
there is an obvious salvation history that hangs together that runs through Abraham and all the passages we chose. And it's like, how do you fit that wisdom literature in? And sometimes there's literature that helps sustain people's daily lives on mission.
Right.
Yeah. But their mission isn't to become a wise people by drawing upon the wisdom gained from all creation. That's not the mission, but it's wisdom, and it's like bread for the journey.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So it plugs in, but it's not really salvation history.
Right.
And it always makes it tough to do a theology that incorporates everything equally.
Sure is, especially when they have 7.
Yeah.
But it was fun. I hope you all, as an audience, enjoyed this. If you have any feedback, we'd love to hear it, I think, unless you think we're idiots. I mean, we're fine here. That not either. But we'll try again next time with the New Testament.
Absolutely.
Until then, thanks for joining us this episode of the After Class podcast, After Class because
the best conversations happen
after class.
Thank you again for listening to the After Class podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Audio production is provided by Drew Nyquist, and social media is managed by Darren Harris.